So welcome to everybody to the JR Book Club. A reminder once again for those who are just joining us, please turn your mics off for now, and we're going to be having questions from you, the audience, later on in the evening. But for now, if you can keep those microphones off, that would be great. So welcome. For this book club, we'll be talking about Invisible Walls, a journalist in search of her life by Hella Pick. Hella arrived in the UK as a Kindertransport refugee and has gone on to become one of the UK's most formidable and distinguished journalists. Invisible Walls is her memoir of a dramatic and fascinating life in which she's covered everything from the American Civil Rights March from Selma to the 1968 student revolts in Paris and the birth of solidarity in Poland. But it's also a book that speaks candidly about her personal relationships and the struggle she's had with her Jewish identity. So I'm delighted to welcome Hella Pick to our event tonight. We're also joined by the journalist and writer Misha Glenny, who'll be speaking to Hella about her book. So Hella Pick arrived in the UK from her birthplace, Vienna, as part of the Kindertransport scheme in 1939. She was on the staff of the Guardian newspaper from 1961 to 1997, working first as UN correspondent, later Washington correspondent, East-West affairs correspondent, diplomatic editor, and associate foreign affairs editor. After leaving the Guardian, she went to work for George Wiedenfeld's Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where she still acts as senior consultant. She has served on the advisory board of the German Jewish Studies Centre at Sussex University for over 10 years and was closely involved in the establishment of the Chair of Israel Studies at Sussex University. Hella is the author of Simon Wiesenthal, A Life in Search of Justice, and also Guilty Victim, Austria, From the Holocaust to Haida. She was awarded a CBE in 2000 and received an honorary doctorate from Sussex University in 2018. And I'd also like to introduce our other guest, Misha Glenny. Misha started his journalistic career in 1986 as a stringer for The Guardian and New Scientist in Vienna, before being appointed the BBC's Central Europe correspondent in 1989. He covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe and the wars in the former Yugoslavia. He's the author of several books, including A History of the Modern Balkans and McMafia, which was made into a successful BBC TV drama, and it also won an Emmy. He's also the presenter and author of the How to Invent a Country podcast for Radio 4. So welcome, Hella and Misha, and welcome to our audience. Please have questions that you can ask for later on in the evening. But to kick us off, we'll start with Hella. And you're going to start by reading us a bit from your book, Invisible Walls, Hella, I think.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you very much for organizing this tonight, and for Misha for volunteering to question me, and I hope discuss with me after I've been through this. And you've already summed up much of what I wanted to say by way of introduction. But I want to point out that the subtitle of my book gives you a hint to the actual title of the book. The title is Invisible Walls, as Rebecca said, but the subtitle is A Journalist in Search of Her Life. And this book really describes the search that I conducted to find my identities, to battle against what I had always seen as invisible barriers towards establishing the security of a bundle of identities that really gave me new roots to my life. Unlike many Kindertransport refugees who opted to write moving books about their family, their origins, and the suffering that their families had undergone in the Holocaust. I focused much more on what I made of my life, how I adapted to a life that felt rootless from it, that had been uprooted from its origins and had to find new firmament in the kind of life that I led. I have written at great length about my journalistic career at The Guardian, and I have gone on to describe some personal relationships which illustrate just as much as my professional life how I had always struggled to escape from my insecurities and never really quite succeeded in finding that bundle of identities that I've already referred to. In the sort of after I left The Guardian, I spent, as Rebecca said, a number of years working with George Weidenfeld, the publisher, whose achievements were considerable and who taught me a great deal about Jewish identity and who I think helped me more than anyone else that I met in my life to finally find a genuine meaning in that identity. And for that reason, I owe him a great gratitude, apart from the fact that he also gave me a second career when I started working for his Institute of Strategic Dialogue, about which I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more later. I'm now just going to read 2 or 3 very short extracts from that book, just to give you a tiny flavor of what this is all about. And I've actually taken this from the final summing up chapter of the book. And this chapter starts off with a date, 1939, a Kindertransport refugee designated as an enemy alien. I jumped to the year 2000, and I've become a commander of the British Empire. And in 2018, first, I get an honorary doctorate from Sussex University. I'm entitled to call myself doctor. And then the accolade of a new identity as a BBC podcast destined to remain for all eternity on a desert island. These are the markers in a colorful life and a long career that offered a role model for women in journalism. It's been quite a journey. But look below the surface of success. Describing my life, how far should I undress myself? How deeply can I expose my mindset and my experiences? How open should I be? Can I be? How far am I capable of confronting myself with me? Having used this memoir to tackle some of these challenges, do I know myself any better now? Has it been a catharsis? Answer, yes, and a partial no. Yes, I've gained a better perspective on the big events and influences in my life. I have a clearer understanding of my contribution to the advance of women in the media. I have been able to remind myself of the opportunities I've had to meet and find friendship among an amazing cast of significant men and women. I've reconstructed in my mind so much of the travel that I've always enjoyed. And here comes the partial no. With so much positive in the memory, sorry, I've lost the next page, in the memory bank, the fundamentals, the root causes of my insecurities have not been banished. When I first outlined this book, I suggested my entire life had been punctuated by insecurities from which no amount of success or achievement had helped me to escape. I'd been caged within invisible walls. But even with all the barriers of the imagination And the uncertainties about the scanning of my life has humbled me to recognize how much I've had to celebrate. It is not the life I yearned for. And yes, for all the stress and strain, the unhappinesses and the losses, I do know that great good luck has been on my side. But it's excellent cause for thankfulness, even for celebration. And with that happy word, I'm going to hand over to Misha and allow myself to be interrogated.
Hella, thank you very much indeed. Now, I have to explain to everyone here that I first met Hella. I don't think she remembers it, but I first met Hella in Vienna in 1986 when I was a mere stringer for The Guardian. And it was during the Waldheim case. So I pitched up in Vienna to become stringer of The Guardian, and suddenly I had this huge story on my patch. And then one day I got a phone call from the then foreign editor, Martin Wollacott, the late lamented Martin Wollacott, who Hella knew extremely well, and I was very fond of indeed. And he said with a mischievous tone to his voice, he said, "Misha, get ready. Hella is coming to see you." Now, for me, I was a complete nervous wreck expecting to meet the great Hella Pick. In fact, I wasn't entirely sure if Hella Pick actually existed because I had been reading her for years from every corner of the earth, and I thought she was this mythical figure. Anyway, the great thing was, of course, is that when Hella came, unlike most correspondents who dropped into Vienna, she knew what she was talking about. She really knew what she was talking about. And we had a fascinating discussion about identity and Austria and her background, and indeed Eastern Europe we talked about as well. And it's that question of identity that I want to start with, which Hella has already raised. She talked at the end about her insecurities. Now, for those of us who first met Hella in the way that I did, insecurity is the last word that you would associate with her, because she appeared so poised, so in control of what she was doing and what she wanted to do on a story, that it simply didn't cross my mind that she could be insecure about anything. One of the great things about this book is the way that those insecurities are revealed and integrated into the extraordinary tales of the great events that she's covered and the great men and women who she's met. So I want to start by asking Hella at the beginning, when you arrive on the 15th of March 1939 at Liverpool Street Station, speaking just one word of English, which rather unfortunately was goodbye, I was very struck. The day after you arrived, you wrote a letter to your mother. And like you, I was very struck by the businesslike tone of your first letter to your mother. After the tumultuous events of the previous year. And it was almost, as I read that letter, it's almost as though you knew that hiding or refashioning your identity was going to be central, not just to your immediate past, but to much of the rest of your life. So I wanted to start, first of all, by asking you how much in the year leading up to Anschluss, I beg your pardon, the year after Anschluss, when the Nazis marched into Vienna, Hitler had that famous speech on the Ringstrasse. How much did you know that you had been living in mortal danger, and you, as a very vulnerable young woman, had escaped into a world which you couldn't possibly calculate or understand in that initial period?
I think it's extremely hard giving you an answer to that. I was not a young woman. I was a young child. I was 8 years old. And I must have been mature for my age. What I regret, and I keep on asking myself why, I have very, very little memory of my life in Vienna. I've tried to reconstruct what little I could somehow remember from a few letters that I found and from a sort of child's birthday book in which my school friends wrote me sort of loving messages of all kinds, and the school teacher wrote into it and so on. But basically, I just have dim memories of my mother. My parents were divorced and I was living with my mother, of my mother being fetched one evening with the Gestapo knocking on the door of our flat, taking my mother away, being left behind with a friend with whom we were sharing a flat at that time, and my mother coming back. And I cannot reconstruct how frightened I was, to what a degree I thought I'd lost her forever. And this happened a second time. She was taken away a second time, and the second time came back. And I think at that point, she decided that it was simply, her own future was totally uncertain and looked extremely unsafe. And that she had to send me away on the Kindertransport, and managed to get me onto the Kindertransport. And the postcard that I sent within a day of arriving in Britain, when I found that, when I started writing this book, I was very surprised that I was so level-headed and just really concentrated on just describing in very sort of brusque terms, just that I had landed with a very pleasant family. And my immediate concern was, would she be able to get out of Austria too? And in a number of postcards, and they were all postcards because I didn't think we were not allowed to send letters, so I had to write openly. I just pressed and pressed and pressed. I said, I order you to come to England.
Well, Hella, I don't blame you at all, because you were a very lonely little girl, notwithstanding the fact that you were taken in by first one English family, then another English family. But your mother actually did arrive not too long afterwards. And yet, of course, central to your experience is the fact, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that A, you did not grow up with a father, and B, your mother and you had a very intense and close relationship, but one which often fractured because of, I would say, the wildly different experiences you had of life. And this is something that comes up repeatedly in the book, where you first of all feel slightly irritated by your mother, then irritated with yourself for feeling irritated with your mother. And there's
I felt guilty.
Yes. And this is really important, your relationship with your mother.
Well, you know, I was the only thing she had. And of course, I was growing up and I wanted my freedom and I wanted to get away. And I hated to see her dependence on me. And of course, what I did was to go as far away as possible, which was after all my very first job. I landed for a great deal of the time in distant West Africa, which to her seemed, you know, like the nether world that was just lurking full of dangers everywhere. And she was very I mean, her love became a very controlling love. And the more I tried to escape, the more she tried to haul me back in. And of course, I felt guilty and loving at the same time. Of course, you know, I loved her deeply and was deeply concerned for her welfare and, you know, for as much happiness as she could get for herself in what had become quite a difficult life. but I was young and I needed my freedom, and she never quite understood.
But as you say, you mentioned West Africa, and I have to say, when I read the book, I knew nothing about your early years of journalism in West Africa. I was completely gripped by this section as a consequence. But it leads us to another issue. There you are in the early to mid 1950s, suddenly wading into what was a very, very male world, the edge of Fleet Street, and gradually you came ever closer to the center of Fleet Street, and of course, the patriarchy of West Africa. And there you were, a young, vivacious, attractive woman in an entirely new environment. Now, one of the things that struck me about the book is that although you knew how to use your charms, you weren't really aware of the fact that you were a woman doing a very difficult job that was dominated by men from every side. How did you perceive it at the time, if you can remember?
Well, I was new to it all. I'd become a journalist by accident. I hadn't trained for it. I had to learn on the spot. And I suddenly found myself in this extraordinary world of West Africa, both French and British West Africa, all of them countries that were in the process of negotiating their independence. It was exhilarating suddenly to be confronted with problems and issues and entirely new acquaintances, friends. And I think I was like a sponge. I just absorbed it all. And, I was quite surprised when I was sort of looking through my papers. I found articles that I'd written sort of within a year of starting on this job. I was appointed, I should add, as commercial editor. And I was supposed to write about economic issues, and then sort of got all involved in the political coverage. But I've discovered articles that I'd written about gold, the price of cocoa, and things like that, which, in a million years today, I couldn't write a sensible article about gold, about cocoa prices or the value of timber and so on. And I was doing that. But, it was a fascinating world because I was meeting political leaders of West Africa who were all in the midst of these negotiations. There was no security. It was very open. I got to know them all very well. I went to their conferences, and I was suddenly an important person in a small world. And I must say, when I think back on that period now, one of the things that I find really striking is that here I was meeting a whole new generation of very aware political leaders, both in French and British West Africa. And none of them were concerned with the past, with history, with slavery. Black Lives Matter would not have been a theme for them. They knew they mattered, and what they were doing was negotiating for their future independence. That is what interested them. They were interested in the future, not in the past. It is such an extraordinary contrast to the present situation.
But I'm going to press you a bit on the issue of your gender, because I noticed it through the book. It sort of, over the years, it slowly dawned on you that you had actually been a real pathbreaker in terms of a woman in a prominent role, particularly when it came to foreign reporting. You mentioned Claire Hollingworth, the great British journalist who announced the beginning of the Second World War on the Polish-German border as a friend, as a mentor. But you were a real beacon for many women later on you didn't really appear to be aware of that. Did it ever occur to you that you had played such an important role? And mention that bit in, I think it was about 1973, when you were appointed to the British diplomatic, the Foreign Office Diplomatic Briefing Corps, and they said you couldn't come because you were a woman. I mean, that was appalling.
I know that was a sort of red alarm signal. No, of course, I don't think I realized during my working life as much as I realize now that I was a kind of pioneer in much of what I did, the role model. What I regret is that I did not involve myself as much as my colleagues, because after all, the number of women journalists rose very rapidly during, it was just in the early years that I was very much on my own, but the women journalists soon multiplied, and some of them really got deeply involved in helping and organizing to promote women in the media in all areas of journalism. And I always just went on my own little path. And of course, many of them were my friends and remain my friends. I did not become active in the organizational work. I discovered through the long years that I've lived that I'm not much of a person for joining organizations. I'm a bit of a sort of lone wolf, if I may say so.
Now, look, before we move on from West Africa, I want you to tell the audience how it was during Nigeria's independence celebration in October 1960 that you stumbled across the person who you think may well have saved your life. Explain to us about that little episode.
Well, that was really a very important event in my life. As you said, I was at the independence celebrations, and one of the people I met there was the then Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, and his name was Ehud Abraham, who's quite famed in the annals of Israeli history because he was one of the people who certainly did a lot of the weapons procurement and many other things for Israel before its independence. But I discovered in getting to know him that he had, in fact, he was of Austrian origin, like I was. He's older than I was, but he was in 1939, he was working for the Youth Aliyah in Vienna, and in fact was responsible for organizing at least part of the Kindertransport out of Austria to Britain. And though he couldn't recall my name, we agreed that he must really have been responsible for getting me put onto one of the Kindertransports. And so in many ways, I can justifiably say that I may have owed him my life. Yeah. And we became very close friends, and he always tried to persuade me to move to Israel, to come and live in Israel. And because he thought that's the place where I ought to be. But I did not think so. I mean, he thought I could easily find work as a journalist in Israel. But it was not for me. I realized I never wanted to live in. I'm not a Zionist.
Well, that moves us on neatly to some of the aspects of journalism that you touch upon in the book. First of all, I have to say if you aren't a journalist, people may find this hard to understand, but you describe the time that you have your first front page splash for The Guardian, which is in 1961. You're in Belgrade at the founding of the non-aligned movement, which younger viewers may not remember, but those who are slightly older will remember that the non-aligned movement, which Tito founded along with the Indonesians, the Cubans and so on, was a very, very big deal. And you got the front page splash on The Guardian from Belgrade. And the reason why I laughed is I remember that when I had my first front page splash on The Guardian, which was when the former Hungarian dictator János Kádár was brought down, and you describe how you spent the day reading and rereading your piece on the front of the paper, and there's that sort of, you know, obsessive pride for a young journalist when you see this for the first time. But it also points to the fact that, let's face it, Hella, we've all got a very strong competitive streak in us, and I see that cropping up in the background throughout this book of you're desperate to get this first.
Indeed, I had actually written that into the original draft of the book, but I think it got cut in the end. But I remember there was one occasion, I think it was the great Reykjavik summit, when Gorbachev met the American president, and between the two of them, at the time they decided that nuclear disarmament was on the cards. And anyway, the journalists from all over the world came, and the big newspapers sent 2 or 3 journalists to cover it. One would cover Reagan, the other one would cover Gorbachev, and so on. And at The Guardian, the story went out that the negotiation between Hella Pick and Michael White, the other correspondent who went to Reykjavik, was much more difficult than the negotiation between Gorbachev and Reagan. So that illustrates the competitiveness.
Exactly. You mentioned when you were the correspondent in Washington at the same time as Simon Winchester, who, again, older viewers may remember. And of course, I can just see the two of you going after story and going, grrr, how am I going to...
All that was very well until the night when we'd both been to the White House Correspondents' dinner. And the next morning, early in the morning, I get a phone call from Simon Winchester's wife saying, Has Simon spent the night with you? I said, no.
Well, I think we're better inquire no further. But so that's also convenient. You talked about the Reykjavik summit in Washington, and you were starting to work in the UN during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You were there. It must have felt at the time like you were at the cutting edge of Armageddon. And at the time, of course, the UN was incredibly important in a way that, if you think about it now, it just isn't. And so I wanted to ask you in a little excursion here, Hella, as to whether you think that we have seen the death of multilateralism as we knew it in the post-Second World War period. Is it dog eat dog from now on?
I think the divisions have become so deep and the dialogue has become so difficult. I mean, not that when I first came to the UN, that was in the early 1960s, the Cold War was very, very cold indeed. And yet, at the UN, people were talking and were, to some extent, listening. And I mean, for me, just to digress a little from what the question you asked me, I think I really learned about international affairs by covering the United Nations during those years, because every major world problem was raised in some way or another in the debating and in the resolutions, and so just by talking to the diplomats. You couldn't do that anymore today. I mean, today, I think the UN sadly has become, well, not irrelevant, but not particularly relevant. I mean, maybe with climate change issues, the UN will acquire war, new meaning which it didn't have before. But that was the period of decolonization, and it was the period of the deep Cold War, and people nevertheless tried to learn how to live together without war. The nuclear deterrent meant something in spite of it. I mean, the nuclear missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, taught something about the nuclear deterrence.
Now, at the same time, this was when you started your relationship, or at least it became quite intense, with Narendra Singh, who was the India's deputy head mission at the UN. I have to say, Hella, your relationships, although often fraught, are with extraordinary people. And Narendra Singh was the son of a Maharaja, which I thought was very, very grand. All this time, those of us who've worked particularly as foreign correspondents, we know that relationships are very fraught because you're moving around all the time, you're meeting all sorts of people. And let's face it, it's extremely difficult to establish stable personal relationships. And while everyone else thinks that the life of a correspondent is probably achingly glamorous, those of us who've been through it also find it extremely painful and difficult when it comes to trying to sort of fashion a stable personal life for yourself. Would you say that you recognize that in yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, but I think I have this sort of added problem, which is really very central to what I write about in the book, which is my need for security and my always wanting more and more proof and evidence of that security. And in my personal relationships, that has certainly also been a major factor. It hasn't just been the moving around and the sort of twin pursuit of personal relationships and a roving correspondence life. It is very difficult. And I mean, I know one or two people have succeeded, but it doesn't really work for many people to have a really good family life and a relationship, and at the same time have this job of forever being moved around from one place to another.
Of course,
So,
you in compensation, you have some extraordinary experiences, and the one that really I felt was very moving in the book was when you met the former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt for the first time, and you sat late into the night talking to him about all the big issues in Germany in particular, in Austria, Nazism, Wiedergutmachung, making things good again, or whatever it is, restitution, all of these big issues, and you say that this is a turning point for you.
Well, it was, because it's not very rational, but I had, without much difficulty, come to terms with Austria, unlike many other refugees from Austria who spent their lives saying they can't possibly go back and all Austrians are Nazis and so on. I never had that feeling, and I felt comfortable going to Austria. But I hadn't reached that point with Germany. I still, I think that's tried to say I saw every German as a Nazi. I didn't, but I felt I just felt uncomfortable with Germany. And then that conversation with Willy Brandt changed it all. I somehow realized that there was a great deal of good in Germany, and that post-war Germany had undergone very genuine, fundamental change, and was itself trying very hard to come to terms with what the Holocaust meant and what it had meant to Germany and to Germans. And from that time onwards, I've come to appreciate Germany, to develop many friendships in Germany, and being happy every time I had an opportunity to go to Germany. And I trace that back to that long night of conversation, and I stress it really was conversation, with Willy Brandt, who then became a very warm friend, kept in touch for the rest of his life, and met from time to time. And it was always, for me, sort of the high point when I had a chance to talk with him.
Yes, and I mean, Brandt really was somebody very, very special in so many ways. And of course, he really, it was his Ostpolitik, the engaging and opening with the East, that laid the ground for something that you covered, and which is incredibly important, laid the ground for détente, which was made concrete by the Helsinki Accords and the Helsinki Agreement. And you went there at the very beginning. I get a sense from reading the book that you thought Helsinki, before people had realized it in the wider world, that Helsinki could lead to a shift in the dynamic of the Cold War.
Yes, I think it was. If you read the Helsinki Declaration and the concessions that were made on both sides, you realize that the Helsinki Declaration did provide an instrument for change and for breaking down the Cold War divisions, because it's in the texts, and people, the texts were implemented in many ways, and it was a process. It was not just a one-time document. But I think from that time on, from 75 onwards, I think the Cold War did start breaking down. And of course, Poland was, I think, the locomotive for that. And I spent a lot of time in Poland. And I think, as many Germans have found, Poland can be very absorbing and to get very much involved with the various factions and so on. But I certainly thought I could see there that it was quite inevitable that the war would eventually come down. But,
yes.
I mean, nobody in 75 foresaw that the Soviet Union would collapse. That's fair enough. But it was the beginning of the end.
Exactly, and as you pointed out, in 1979, you were there when Pope John Paul II returned to Poland, and you were in the presence of the later Prime Minister of Poland, Mieczysław Rakowski, and he turned to you and said, Poland will never be the same again. And although it was still another 10 years to go, he was basically right. By that time, things had shifted.
No, that was actually sooner. That conversation with Rakowski was at the Pope's first visit to Poland, which was 7 years earlier. His second visit was in 1988, and by that time they were on the verge of.
No, I meant yes, I meant the first visit you had the conversation.
The first visit
in 1979.
That's right. When I toured, I joined the Pope's procession through Poland, which was absolutely fascinating because millions of Poles turned up to wherever he held the mass. And at the end of that, I found myself outside in the courtyard of the Bishop's Palace in Krakow, together with the other journalists who had covered that trip. And that included, at that time, Mieczysław Rakowski, who then was the editor of a weekly journal long before he became, or sometime before he became Prime Minister. And he turned to me, and that's when he said, Poland will never be the same again. I mean, he saw at that moment that the Pope's battalions had won over the Russian battalions, the Soviet battalions, and the communist battalions. The people had spoken, and it was a big turning point, that Pope's first visit to Poland.
Now, I don't want to hog you all for myself. I want to get the audience coming in, but there are a couple more things I just want to I want to mention. First of all, there was this extraordinary incident when you became friendly, or process when you became friendly with the Aga Khan, who was, of course, the leader of the Ismaili community of Shia Muslims, and you slightly, correct me if I'm wrong, but you slightly fell under his spell, and he asked you to come and write a book. It all sort of goes disastrously wrong. So what is a child from the Kindertransport doing, going to collaborate on a book with the Aga Khan? How did that go?
Well, ask him why he wanted me to collaborate with him. No, I know what had happened was, these accidental things happen. Among my close friends in America, someone who acted as the Aga Khan's sort of personal PR front man, and he introduced me to the Aga Khan and suggested that I should write an interview with him for The Guardian about his really quite remarkable work in the Third World. And that interview happened, and the Aga Khan liked what I wrote. And in the wake of that, approached me and said he would be celebrating his silver jubilee in the next 2 years. And would I write his biography? And of course, I was rather startled, but at the same time, it did seem a very glamorous kind of thing to be doing, following around the Aga Khan and writing about what the super rich did with their lives. But anyway, not everybody thought it was such a good idea, but the Guardian agreed to give me a sabbatical. And off I went to write this biography, and I had an absolutely fascinating time. I learned a lot about the Islamic community, about the Ismailis, who are a very liberal expression of Islam, and they're scattered around the world, very much like Jews are. And they're actually organized very much like Jewish communities are organized. So I recognized there are a lot of commonalities there. And I was really interested in the development work that the Aga Khan was doing. And, I wrote my book, and, he saw it chapter by chapter, and he seemed to approve of everything. But anyway, it all came to grief because he decided that he had to show the draft to the leaders of several of the Ismaili communities around the world. And they realized there that he'd been rather too frank with me, and they didn't like some of the things they read. And I think the end result of that was that he changed his mind and thought it was really doing too much good to have that book published. So sadly, it never appeared. But I can still look at my draft.
Well,
and relive that interesting period.
I'm not going to. I was hoping, although it's been so fascinating that we haven't yet got to it. I was hoping that we might talk about the revolutions of '89 in Yugoslavia, but maybe we can talk about that and the world after 1989. Maybe we'll have some chance to hear your thoughts about that during the questions. But I do want to ask a final question about somebody you've mentioned. I have to say that I have a personal relationship with this chap as well, because in 1956, my father was attending a fireworks party somewhere in London, and a rocket fell over and hit him in the chest and knocked him out. And when he came to, he was lying on a sofa, And there was a man standing over him and asking him if he was all right. And then he asked him what my father did. And he said, well, I'm in insurance, but I hate it. And what I really want to be is a translator. And so the man said, oh, well, I run a publishing company. Can you translate a couple of German books and French books for me? To which my father said, yes. And my father ended up translating Bulgakov and Solzhenitsyn and Babel and so on and so forth. And the man who changed his life was one George Weidenfeld, whose life really was one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. And of course, Hella, he had a really profound impact on you as well. Tell us a bit about that before I throw things open to the audience.
Well, he changed my life as well. He really, you know, when the Guardian decided I had outgrown its readership, I've been there too long, I felt completely devastated. And George Weidenfeld, whom I'd known for some time, came to the rescue, first by asking me to write the biography of Simon Wiesenthal, and then by asking me to help him with some of the conferences that he was organizing. And after a while, I became one of the founding members of his Institute of Strategic Dialogue, and spent another 15 years or so organizing conferences, traveling to China, working with George, getting involved with Sussex University and Jewish studies there, and altogether meeting a whole new group of people and having a sort of extension of my active life. I mean, George was somebody who decided never to retire, and indeed he was working up to about a week before he died at the age of 96. And he taught me at one time to do exactly the same thing. I mean, I couldn't imagine not working. And he really created, he was a man who always looked to the future. He was a man who always looked to building bridges. And he was also a man whose commitment to Israel and to Jews, to the safety and security of the Jewish world was the most important thing in his life. And he taught me a great deal and helped me to come to much better terms of myself as a Jew, and as a Jew who is conscious of her identity and what that means in the world today.
Ella, thank you very much indeed. I fear I've kept you talking for far too long, but let me. I know there are going to be a lot of questions, so I'm going to hand it back to Rebecca, and she, I think, is going to moderate the questions to you, which will doubtless be many and varied. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed for sharing the wisdom of your extraordinary experiences with us.
Well, my experiences leave out the wisdom. I'm not so sure about that. Thank you, Misha.
Thank you, Hella, and thank you very much, Misha. That was a really fascinating conversation, and one I think we're looking forward to continuing. So this is just to remind people that you can send in questions to Hella, and possibly if you have anything for Misha too, on the Q&A section of Zoom. We also have a big audience on YouTube, so please do send in your comments on the comment section of YouTube, and we will forward them to Hella. So I actually would like to kick it off by asking you, Hella, myself a question, which I'd been thinking about when I read the book. Your style of journalism is sort of something that is now considered perhaps quite old school, in that the print industry was big and thriving when you were writing. These days, the print industry is declining, but there has been a rise in this so-called citizen journalism, where people contribute by filming things on their phones or sending in bits for comments or blogs and that sort of thing. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of journalism today and whether this citizen journalism or participation by members of the public and people who are on the scene when things happen, is that something that you think is an open and a democratic way in which journalism can move forward? Or is it something that's possibly a little bit dangerous and a negative thing? What do you think about journalism today?
Well, I think journalism has changed out of all recognition, but except that I think professionalism in journalism has not changed. To be a good professional journalist takes understanding and knowledge of what one does. But I think the framework for journalism today is so totally changed to the framework that I had that served me during most of my certainly journalistic career, that I know I would have to start to learn all over again. Because after all, I worked without, so the social media did not exist. We didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have the internet for much of my, for most of the period during which I worked. So I'm only superficially competent to talk about how journalism works today, because I think if I became diplomatic editor of The Guardian today, my craft, my writing itself, I hope would be unchanged, but the surroundings in which I had to work, the kind of schedules I would have to keep would be very different. Also, of course, I would have access to far more information than I had when I was working. I mean, I didn't have Google. I couldn't pick up the phone to other people on their mobile phones. It was hard to find people when you wanted to contact them. So, it was all so different. And of course, the problem is that the business models of news organizations have had to change radically. And the big question is whether the print media will survive at all. And so far, so good, but the circulation, of course, has diminished hugely. Advertising has diminished enormously on print media. And all the emphasis is now on the net. So, it's a different world. And I feel like an old fuddy-duddy sometimes who doesn't really quite grasp it all. But I think the social media and the citizen journalist does more harm than good today. And my Institute of Strategic Dialogue, which tracks some of this, knows just what dangerous material is constantly being floated on the social media and how it influences us all.
Because it's inaccurate and it's often not checked, and the sources are
distorted. Just look at, for example, the anti-vax campaign on social
Mm.
media.
Yes, yeah. Okay, well, let's go to Joan Lipkin-Edwards, who has the question for you, Hella. So, Joan, would you like to ask your question direct to Hella?
I was just wondering whether she's still as active as she always seems to have been, and if not, Hella, do you miss it?
Washington. Sorry, I didn't understand.
Your life, everything you've done in your life, you've been so busy.
Do I miss it?
Yes.
Well, I'm still busy, is the answer. During lockdown, for instance, I spent most of it writing about 2/3 of this book. I'd started it before lockdown, but during this period, I really, just disciplined myself, and every morning came to my computer and sat down, around 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'd write till about 5 in the afternoon, and I was exhausted. By that time, Netflix was the next point on the agenda. But, and now I'm partly busy promoting this book. I'm much involved with the Sussex University Institute for Jewish Studies, and trying to help with the fundraising, which at this point is not very easy, and doing other things. And now that we've got some opening, I'm actually going to have the chance to see some of my friends again, and to indulge in some cooking for other people and so on. So I'm not about to sort of retire into doing nothing. Don't worry.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Joan, and thanks, Hella. And let's go now to Bettina Cunardo. Bettina, you've got a question for Hella.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating recall of your life. And I am researching the Times and Life building in London. And I was wondering if you have ever worked there.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand your question.
Well, I've been researching the Times and Life building that is in Mayfair in London.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
I know during the 70s, there were some publishing houses and some newspapers, and I think Times and Life magazine. And well, I'm not in London, I'm in Buenos Aires, so it's difficult for me to access information. And I was wondering if you have ever worked there and if you have any memories of those years.
I haven't worked there, and so I have no memories of that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Sorry.
It's been a pleasure to listen to you.
I'm so sorry, but my work has always been at The Guardian.
Okay. And do you remember which newspapers were there? Do you have any idea?
No, I just don't know. I really have, maybe I'm suffering from Alzheimer's, but I have no memories of this. I'm so sorry.
Well, no, thank you very, very much.
I apologize. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bettina. Hella, you've covered such a wide spectrum of countries and met so many people. I mean, your work's taken you from west to east and everywhere in between. It feels like there can't be possibly anywhere in the world you might not have covered. But is there somewhere or a story that you haven't covered that you think, I would like to look into that?
Oh goodness, I haven't covered. I've covered only a fraction of what has gone on in the world. But for example, I have never set foot in Australia. Sometimes I think I really would be quite interested to know more about Australia and write about a little bit of what goes on there. I have never really written much about Southeast Asia, even though I've been to Thailand and to Vietnam and to Laos, traveling with pleasure. But I've never covered events out there. I've really, my sort of main routes of operation has been either America or Europe. And I have written very little about the Middle East, only in terms of sort of big conferences where Middle East affairs have cropped up. I did go to Israel briefly during the Eichmann trial and wrote about that, but only as one of other Guardian correspondents who were out there. So, there are large chunks of the world that have been untouched by the pick touch.
And is there somewhere that you still think, I have a fascination with this place or this story that...
Oh, I'd love to be back as a Washington correspondent.
People can turn their mics off, please. We just had a little bit of sound. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Hella. Yes, you wanted to be back in Washington.
Oh, sorry. I thought I can see Carol's iPhone on the screen. I thought somebody else was trying to ask a question. No, if you ask me where would I like to be reporting today, I think it would be back in Washington. It's
Yes.
Washington's always full of interest, always have good stories. You're never short of anything to write about, and meeting very interesting people who, are in positions of power.
Yes, well, certainly over the past few years, with the political intrigue that's been going on in Washington, yes, that would have been something that would have kept you very busy. Yes. Okay, we've got a question from Irene Wise next. So if we can go to Irene. Hello, Irene.
Hello, I just had to unmute myself. Hello, Hella, thank you. That was a fascinating conversation. That was wonderful. I remember you coming to Wimbledon Synagogue. I don't know if you remember that, in probably the year 2000, just after you'd published Guilty Victim, talking about Austria. And you were very, very positive about the Austrians' attitude to your being Jewish. And I know that, obviously Simon Wiesenthal chose to live there as well all his life. And do you still feel so positive about European or just attitudes around the world to the Jewish community now? I mean, how do you feel about anti-Semitism? This is a huge question, but has it changed very much, your attitude, since then?
Well, I think I've become much more conscious of anti-Semitism now. I think one of the reasons is that anti-Semitism is more powerful today than it was, I think, what's it now, 21 years ago when we probably first met.
Yes.
But I'm not particularly worried about Austria per se, actually, because I do go to Austria quite often. In fact, I was lucky enough to be able to get there quite recently. And yes, it hasn't gone away. But I think the far right in Austria has become much weaker. And the Chancellor of Austria is really providing, in this particular case, in terms of anti-Semitism, relationships and the relationship with Israel, a very positive attitude, a very positive image. He himself is, Austria is never free of political quarrels, allegations of corruption, and this, that, and the other. They're busy at it at the moment, just as they always are. But he's a young man. He came to this without baggage, and I think from the beginning he took the attitude that he wanted Austria to have good relationships with Israel, and that he wanted to stand out as someone who was determined to keep anti-Semitism down as much as possible. And I think, he continues to assert these views now. And with Israel, they made some bizarre pact even about access to vaccines, that Israel somehow gave some of the Pfizer vaccine that they had as surplus to Austria so that they could speed up their vaccination campaign. So, sort of a little bizarre side remark to that. But in general, of course, in Europe, and particularly in Germany, anti-Semitism is worrying, and it's worrying in this country.
Yes.
I mean, we've just seen this very, very clearly during the last few days in the sort of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, the degree to which they also were anti-Semitic manifestations, and always over and over again that you identify anti-Semitism and Israel as if they were one, as if all Jews are tarred by what Mr. Netanyahu does.
Yeah.
So, so this is worrying, and this is why really I became so involved when Sussex University decided to launch this Institute of Jewish Studies, because I think they can do valuable work. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that the German government has given to the Sussex University a professorship for this Institute of Jewish Studies, which is quite distinct to the professorship of Israel Studies at Sussex University. But they are in fact funding a professorship within the context of that institute. So that is a German, very practical and valuable gesture, again, in their fight against anti-Semitism.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, does that give you an answer at all?
No, that's great. Thank you. It
was rather a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
It's a very good answer, and lovely to see you again. And also, thank you so much for being such a fantastic role model to women. Thank you very much.
That's a real compliment.
But it's true.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, Rebecca, I'm going to mute myself again. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you, Irene, and thank you, Hella, for answering. We have another question from Anthony Gilbert. So if we can bring up Anthony Gilbert, please, Aviva.
Hello,
Anthony.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
I simply asked, what do you make of anti-Semitism on the left in Great Britain today? It's been very much featured in the news, and it seems to have certainly caused major trouble within the Labour Party, and I wondered what your view was about it. Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, there's a very short answer to that. I don't like it, and it shouldn't be happening. And I can't judge how deep, to what extent this has really taken deep root in the Labour Party. And certainly Keir Starmer is doing everything he possibly can to stamp it out. And one has to respect him for what he's doing. And I think it has had an impact, a positive impact. And I think he will continue to do his best. But, in the end, you have to realize that, there is a wing of the Labour Party which believes in the Palestinian cause and which equates the Palestinian cause with being critical of Jews and which fuels anti-Semitism. And this is a hard battle to overcome, hard battle to fight, and difficult to overcome. And I have to say, as a Jew, what I have seen in the last few days of what Israel has done in Gaza, I can't say that I can condone this. Killing children should not be something that Jews should be doing. And totally destroying civilian life in Gaza is not something that is in the interest of Jewish security or the Jewish state. So I can understand that if you are committed to the Palestinian cause, as some members of the Labour Party are, but they would feel very, very critical of what Israel, in the so-called interests of the Jewish world, has been doing in Gaza. So you may not agree with me, but I certainly think one has to understand why people become anti-Semitic under present circumstances.
Thank you very much for that. I hope you're right that Keir Starmer will indeed help remove some of that. I agree with you that one looks aghast at what happens with Israel. I think my comment is that I think Israel is held to a sort of standard which other countries, Syria, Iran, are not. And that's very hard on Israel, but I agree with you. What's happened is just too awful for words. Again,
I think also,
yes, go ahead, please.
I think also the trouble is that where I take issue with sort of pro-Palestinian cause is that they equate all Jews with what the Israeli government is doing.
Indeed, indeed.
One should not be equating. I mean, this is not a justification for for anti-Semitism. What has happened is justification for saying that Mr. Netanyahu should no longer be Prime Minister of Israel.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you also, Misha, for that lovely introduction you gave to Hella. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hella. Just before we wind up, Misha, I'll just go back to you for any further questions from you before we finish. Was there?
I was going to ask Hella and have a brief little chat with her about both of us experienced 1989, the revolutions in Eastern Europe, as an extraordinary epochal turning point, certainly in European history, but as it turns out in world history as well. And of course, immediately after that, I reported very extensively on the trauma of the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I feel as though since then, and I don't know whether Hella agrees, we have been in many ways adrift. We have lost the certainty of politics, and sometimes one feels not nostalgic, but one feels as though the period of the Cold War was a period that you could comprehend. And everything that is going on now, whichever part of the world you live in, it is a really very disturbing and distressing experience socially and politically. And I wonder, Hella, whether you agree with that, or whether you think that we will march on towards progress relentlessly.
No, I totally agree with you. I really despair when I look at the world today and see people talking past each other. Everybody is in their own little enclave. They don't talk to each other. In a way, what is happening in the American Congress at the moment is a microcosm of what is happening in the world at large. That here are powerful factions that no longer know how to talk with each other. And I think this is what's happening worldwide. It's happening between Britain and the European Union. To some extent, it's happening within the European Union. With Russia, there is no real mutual attempt to understand.
Oh.
Aviva, are we okay? I think we're still okay.
I think we're still live.
I think we're fine, Hella. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I mean, I can only, as I say, echo what Misha said just now. Yeah. I think the world is adrift at the moment. Different power points are all working in their own little enclave, and just conceivably, the climate crisis could bring countries together again. But I'm I'm sorry that if we are ending on such a negative note, but I think you're absolutely right.
But I wanted to end on a positive note, and that is, I have had the good fortune to have read Invisible Walls. And can I say that in this conversation, we have barely touched the substance of this book. And it really is an incredible journey through the post-war world. So if anyone is hesitating or thinking about not buying this book, I would urge you to reconsider immediately and go out and buy one, preferably from an independent bookshop, but that's my own little thing.
Yes.
Misha, can I just add, in order to encourage people to read it, that it has a lot of amusing, light-hearted anecdotes in which it isn't all serious stuff.
No, it's not.
You might actually get a laugh out of it at times.
You'll get a laugh out of it, and also there's a lot of really human stuff in there.
I'm sorry, we've had some sort of power cut, but I think the Zoom is still continuing, so we'll just carry on. We're still here.
I was going to say that it weaves the personal and the political, and that weave is seamless. So please go out and buy it, because it's you won't regret it, believe me.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed, Misha. And I was saying to Hella earlier that it was full of entertaining anecdotes and incidents, apart from the very interesting political and geopolitical discussions in there. So yes, I highly recommend it. It's been really wonderful to speak to you and hear from you tonight, Hella. And I think we've all enjoyed and had some insight into your work and the world that you've been reporting on over the last, well, a long time, but it's
long.
Yes, yeah, and you are still very much involved today. And also thank you, Misha, for your extremely insightful questions. I'd also like to thank Jewish Book Week, who are in association with us in organising this event. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience, everyone who has tuned in on Zoom and on YouTube. It's been lovely to have you tonight. Please join us again for our Bloomsday celebration on June the 16th, when we'll be talking about Jewish Ireland. And until then, thank you all again and wishing you a very good evening.